Welcome again to this afternoon's discussion on peace and security with Ameerah Haq. Before I get any further, please, as you listen to Ameerah's presentation today, think of questions, think about any aspect of UN peacekeeping that you'd like to ask Ameerah about, because frankly, we are incredibly privileged to have such an expert, such a resource with us this afternoon. Ameerah has worked within the UN system for 4 decades. She started as an infant, and which has allowed her to thrive and to really appreciate the UN culture. Ameerah started as a junior officer at UNDP, straight out of grad school, working in farming and fishing villages, working on economic prosperity and livelihood, and then transitioned to working with refugees, not only in Africa, but in Asia, not just in terms of their basic human needs, but working on their livelihoods, working with refugees to make sure that they could reset their lives and move forward as independent actors in the country in which they ended up. Ameerah headed the peacekeeping operation in Timor-Leste as a special representative of the Secretary General for East Timor, and ultimately ended up as Undersecretary General of the United Nations for the Department of Field Support from 2012 to 2014. And currently she serves as Vice Chairman of a special high-level panel that the Secretary General has appointed to look at the future of UN peacekeeping, and it was indeed a very wise choice to ask Ameerah to play that role. Before I turn it over to Ameerah for her remarks, and then ultimately to your questions and answers, I think it's important to recognize just one of the amazing backgrounds she has. She was born and raised in Bangladesh. She was educated by nuns in Bangladesh. They encouraged her to get a higher education. She was ultimately educated, received her higher education here in the United States, first in Ohio, and then at graduate school in New York. And we are really lucky to have Ameerah with us today. We're really lucky that she has served for so many years in the UN system. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ameerah for her remarks. Thank you very much. I'm going to adjust these because you have to get them.
Oh, okay.
There we go. Speak right there.
Okay. Thank you, Peter, for that introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to all of you. I'm going to start out with a story about a little girl in South Sudan whose name is Niakat Pal. Last April, Niakat walked for 4 hours. She led her blind father to a UNICEF and a World Food Program response distribution center in Upper Nile State of South Sudan. Her mother had left them because her mother went to look for her missing brother. And Niakat heard that this center was providing food and water. And so she walked for 4 hours, leading her blind father through very harsh and dangerous areas. These are areas that had seen some of the most serious fighting between the rebels and the South Sudanese army, and United Nations peacekeepers that we just saw had been deployed to protect the civilian population as part of the United Nations mission in South Sudan. So at the end of the journey, Nyakat got what she was looking for, and then she headed back with the supplies that she got from that center, again, leading her father 4 hours by foot back to her village. The reason that I tell you this story is this is the story that will guide a report that Peter referred to that I am part of in the panel. And we highlight this report because we think that Nyakat's story is at the heart of what the United Nations was created for 70 years ago. The Charter said that what the United Nations is all about is to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and in the dignity and worth of the human person. And today, Nyakat's story represents what the United Nations stands for. So, I think the United Nations will remain relevant as long as it is able to respond effectively to the expectations of people like Nyakat, sometimes who are experiencing the greatest hardship in the most remote areas, inaccessible places, and yet they demonstrate such enormous resilience, pride, and bravery. I think the organization will remain legitimate to the extent that it acts as a voice for the unheard and those who are seeking their views and ensuring their full participation. And the organization will remain credible if its leaders, to the extent that its leaders and the staff and the peacekeepers and all of those that you saw there who go behind creating all of this, demonstrate the courage and the independence, but also the compassion and humility that is required to act upon the norms, the principles, and the values which the United Nations organization was founded. And in that context, I really want to thank you, each and every one of you, because I think in the end that's what you're doing in your communities, in the various parts of this country, trying to raise awareness of what it is, what were the fundamental principles that guided the founding of this institution, what does it stand for, and how are we going to help all the other Nyakats of the world. So my deepest admiration and respect to each and every single one of you who are taking this initiative and who have the courage and the independence to try and translate what it is that the United Nations is all about. So again, thank you very much. I think for all of us who have worked in the United Nations these many years, we wouldn't be able to do what we do if it wasn't for your continued and relentless advocacy on behalf of the principles of the United Nations and working with those who matter in the end in terms of getting all the resources. But it's just not the resources. In the end, it's all about the encouragement and sort of knowing that there is a system behind this support that is required of this institution, which is an institution for all of us. For as we said, it's to look at the dignity and worth of the human person wherever that human person is and under whatever conditions that they live in. So again, thank you very much. With that, perhaps let me just tell you, as Peter said just now, that I have just retired from the United Nations after 40 years of service. And thank you. And I was at a meeting of a number of senior people at the UN, and there were a number of us who were sitting around the table at dinner, and each one of us had worked for fairly significant part of our lives in the UN, and we were talking amongst ourselves, and we were saying, if we had to sort of do it all over again, would we? And I can tell you that without batting an eyelid, all of us said we would. And so to me, I think that is a testimony to what the United Nations is all about, and to what it means for us, what it means for you, that the fact that we would repeat the time that we have spent there in what we hope is making some contribution. So, the 40 years that I have worked in the UN, as Peter said, started out with working in the development field, and I've worked in many countries and lived in many countries, and of the 40 years, I've spent 21 years in the field and 19 years at headquarters. So I think I've got a good balance of looking at the organization from both perspectives of being where the action is, but also importantly of being at headquarters where policies, rules, regulations, the interaction with member states and a lot of that happens as well. And in the course of my career, I've also worked, as I said, I started out in development. I've worked in the humanitarian field and ended with the last 10 years in peacekeeping. And I started out my career in development first in Indonesia in 1976. And I went to Afghanistan in 1978, and I was in Afghanistan when the Russians came in, and left in 1981. In development, I've worked in Laos and Malaysia as well, and have in peacekeeping, I went back to Afghanistan in the peacekeeping framework in 2004, and then I worked in Sudan. I worked in Afghanistan from 2004 to 2007. I worked in Sudan from 2007 to 2009, and then from my last assignment in the field was in Timor-Leste, or East Timor, from 2010 to 2012. And in East Timor, I had the privilege of closing a UN mission. And that is a rare experience because very often we don't see the exit point. And, I think in my career, I have been, as I always tell people, and I said recently at my farewell speech as well, I feel very privileged because I think that the different assignments that I had in different countries and in various parts of the work of the United Nations all sort of followed a logical conclusion at the end when I look back at it. And to culminate, I think, my field work with the work in East Timor, and I think one of the most poignant moments that I experienced in my career was to pull down, the UN flag and say, we have done what we, what we came here to do, and there was a very proud, Timorese leadership standing there with us, thankful and grateful for what the UN had done, but also, I think, very proud to see the East Timor flag flying by itself as it should be. And so I think these are moments. It's very difficult to translate what that feeling is, but to see a country that had such a traumatic birth of the nation, that went through a conflict of immense proportions, internal conflict, after the UN had been there and thought that they had, sort of arrived at a good place to be able to leave the country, and the country had to ask the United Nations to come back again. And when the United Nations did, after the crisis in 2006, the leadership in that country, and particularly President Ramaphosa, had said, I will never go back to the United Nations again to request their help. So we've got to get it right this time. And I think there are different lessons that we learn, but I think the strength and resolve of national leadership is a critical factor, and so it was my privilege to have worked with that leadership and to see their determination that they were going to make it, and indeed they did. And the partnership with the United Nations was a very strong partnership, so I was privileged to be in that. It wasn't the same, for example, when I was in Sudan. It was a very difficult partnership because the government wasn't keen to have the mission in Darfur. It was difficult to work with the comprehensive peace agreement between North and South Sudan. So, there are different tensions. And I remember, since I'm retired now, I can be much more candid and open. But I remember telling people that, every time I walked into a government meeting, it was always like, take a deep breath and walk into the room. And, especially because I was the humanitarian coordinator at that time for the largest humanitarian program in the world, which was happening in Darfur. And it was constantly asking and requesting the government to give us access to go to those areas where we were getting reports of civilians that were in very difficult situations with, rape and torture and bombing and killing, and it was very difficult to negotiate the access for the UN to get there and to try and report on what was happening. So, different experiences. And as I mentioned to you, I was in Afghanistan from 1978 to 1981. And, some of you may have, in your travels, gone to Afghanistan at that point. But Afghanistan was, the sort of the magnet for countries around the region. We would have visitors from India and Pakistan and, other Iran and other neighboring countries who would come to this wonderful little jewel of a place, picturesque, beautiful, fruit and, dried, sort of nuts and raisins and, a wonderful place. But it's so difficult to see the underlying, this was all in Kabul and great, but, to see what were the underlying tensions in the rural areas and the inequalities that led to the king being deposed. And then, of course, we all know the history. So when I left Afghanistan in 1981, I returned again in 2002 in January, and I could not recognize the Kabul that I had left, years ago. And, there was just, the influx of people, the devastation, ministries that we had worked with in a development context, just shattered, a country entirely broken. And again, the steps from then on to try and see how you, resurrect some of the institutions of state and civil society in a post-conflict situation, and the difficulties inherent in that. At the culmination of all of this, and I really felt that East Timor, the end of my tenure in East Timor was a good way to end my career, and that's what I had thought of doing, except that the Secretary General asked me if I would come and lead the Department of Field Support, primarily because I had worked in three special political or peacekeeping missions, and I had spent 10 years in the field, and he felt that that experience would bode well for someone who was now managing a department who would understand what the needs of the field were, and I allowed myself to be persuaded to take that job, and that's what I did in the last 2.5 years. And that's a massive undertaking as well. The budget of the peacekeeping, as you know, is $9.2 billion now. 116,000 almost. It fluctuates a little bit, but somewhere around 120,000 troops that are positioned in 17 peacekeeping missions, and a huge logistical challenge to be able to support those peacekeeping operations. But just by way of context, and some of you may have seen this article in Business Week, it was early last year, where at that point the peacekeeping budget was $8 billion, and it was mentioned that $8 billion was the amount that was spent on air conditioning for the U.S. troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. But at that point, that $8 billion was supporting 17 peacekeeping missions with 120,000 personnel in these various different countries. So the only reason I say that is that peacekeeping, we strive to have efficiency and effective use of resources, and particularly as you go tomorrow to do the advocacy, I think it's important to bear in mind that 17 conflicts that have some kind of that have the United Nations presence is still an effective way of doing it, and even within that we still try to make efficiencies and better use of resources. But now the panel that I'm working on, we're trying to see what can be done and what is the future of United Nations, peacekeeping and special political missions. So again, as I retired in January, the Secretary General asked me whether I would be on this panel, and José Ramos Horta, who was the president of East Timor when I served there, was the chair, and he also asked whether I would join him and be his vice chair, and so I felt that it was a good way at the end of 40 years to try and be part of this panel and to take sort of a dispassionate look at the United Nations as an independent member, and to see what could be done in terms of looking at the future, and to see where does the United Nations best situate itself in the context of the changing world that we find ourselves in. And I understand you did have a discussion yesterday with Ken Payumo, who told you of, I guess, some of the difficulties inherent now, particularly security considerations. But we're looking at the larger, sort of gamut of what is the context today, what is it that the United Nations can do, where can the United Nations go, what does it need, what should be its sort of standards and principles within which it goes into these very difficult threat environments, harsher terrains, logistical challenges, and what is it that needs to guide future Secretary General, because this Secretary General will soon be leaving, but in the future. And this follows from the report that Lakhdar Brahimi did 15 years on, and I think the Secretary General felt that it was very important in the context of the recent threats and the changing context of the world to try and situate the United Nations better. I'm not at liberty to tell you, the recommendations. We will be giving the Secretary General the report on the 16th. But we consulted widely. We went to all the regions. We had discussions, not only with member states and governments. We met extensively with civil society, with think tanks, with academia, with United Nations personnel in those areas. And I can just tell you some of the issues that we came up with, which sort of, I think, will predominate our report. The first and foremost is what we said is the primacy of politics. That it is in the end the political solution and the political framework that ought to guide the United Nations missions there. And very often we find ourselves now going into theaters and areas where we know that something is required in terms of protection of civilians, and we're responding to it, but we are not focusing sufficiently on what is the political settlement. And the political settlement cannot be done by the United Nations alone. It requires member states, regional organizations, and many other parties and partners to come together to say what in the end are, what is required in the context of Mali. And in the absence of a political agreement, is the United Nations in a place to have a mission there? What is the goal that we're working? What is the exit strategy? Because very often we see many of our United Nations missions, for example, in Congo, where literally we've been there since the beginning and the birth of the United Nations. But why is it that we keep going back? Why is it that we keep going back in Haiti? What is eluding us in some of these presences? Are we actually addressing the fundamental root causes? And some of it is, looking into national leadership. And one of the reasons, as I mentioned earlier, in East Timor, and I hold that as an example, is the resolve of the national leadership. But unfortunately, we do not see that resolve in many and most of the countries that we're in today. And, Africa this year will have 7 elections. But in most of those elections, it is those who have been in power for decades who are interested only in continuing with their power and their stronghold in these nations. So, absent the ability to grasp some of these political issues that are at the root of what we must do. There are larger issues like entrenchment sometimes of leaderships in sort of power structures that go into the seepage and the leakage of the natural resources of these really resource-rich countries. So no revenues accruing to that country and for the development of the people, because all of it is going out either through criminalized power structures or other emblems of power. So there are many fundamental issues which require a much greater involvement of regional countries, of member states that have influence in certain nations. But at the heart of it, we have said that it is the politics that must guide and must be the bedrock upon which UN interventions are done. We've got a whole spectrum of resources in the UN. It can be from the Secretary General's good offices, to sending out mediators, to sending out special envoys, to having preventive work, to having a special political mission, as Afghanistan was, and now we have others in Libya and Iraq and others, or a peacekeeping mission, of which there are 17 right now. But there's a whole spectrum that we can look at. So we should be flexible in terms of seeing which is the right tool for the right response. And finally, of course, internally, and we have not shied away from self-criticism of where the UN is. The UN has the ability to bring together development, human rights, humanitarian, politics, all of that. I don't think the United Nations is doing that as well as it should, and there are many reasons, but we certainly address some of those issues. But in the end, for peace operations, we have made some strong messages about being more focused on the field, because again, having served in the field and in headquarters, I know that there is a tendency sometimes to be very headquarters-centric in terms of policies, rules, and regulations, and not understanding the field dimension. And so we talk about being more field-focused. There are many elements of protection of civilians. How do we build peace, and do the peace building, which is as important so that countries don't relapse into conflict. So those are some of the issues. There are plenty more, but I'm sure some of it will come up in questions. So I think I've spoken. Perhaps I don't know what my time limit was for speaking, but I think the best may be to get questions and really respond to some of the issues that you might have a particular interest in. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Someone here? Great. No? There we go. Thank you, Ameerah, for such a comprehensive statement. I'm going to ask one question, and I'll turn it over to everybody, so be thinking about your questions. Is it time for a woman Secretary General of the United Nations? You've been in the UN system. You can tell us what you really think. Is it time for a woman Secretary General? And from your perspective, how would a woman Secretary General perhaps look at things a little bit differently on all the issues that you work on? So why don't you tackle that one, and then people will collect your questions.
Yeah, I think it is,
It's on.
So, absolutely, I think, as in many spheres, it is time, I think, for the world to recognize better, I think, the potential of women. And, our report addresses that issue of bringing women more into many elements of what the UN does. And I've always been guided by this very wise Chinese proverb that says, "Women hold up half the sky." And but I think there is a particular, and you asked about what is the particular dimension. I don't want to, particularly being a woman myself, I don't want to take more credit in terms of my gender. But I think there is an element of seeing perhaps a deeper aspect of whether it is peace or humanitarian assistance or development assistance, because I do believe that the benefits of development and humanitarian work and peace to women translates, I think, in a more direct way to families and to communities. And so we have talked about very often the role and the place of women at the negotiating table. And when I was working in Sudan and when I was in Darfur, I remember it was very difficult to say that women should also be at the negotiating tables. And we were able to work with some women's group and have them included. But I think in all the work that we do in peacekeeping and mediation, and I've got a couple of colleagues here who are from the UNDP, who heard Burst talk, and I think I saw David Stillman's name somewhere, also in the UN, and has worked with development issues independently. I remember particularly this one project that the UNDP worked in Albania. And it was related to the proliferation of small arms immediately, and the lack of security, obviously inherent from this widespread proliferation of arms in the community. And I remember this project. The success of the project was when they brought the mothers into the room, in terms of really convincing these young men to give up their arms and to then, so it was sort of an exchange, bring in your weapons and then we exchange it with something good for your community. But in the end, it was that, those meetings that in these, community centers and rooms and, that were taking place all over the country. But it was in the end when the mothers were brought in that they were really able to appeal to some part of, the psyche or whatever it was, which allowed, which motivated these young men to turn their weapons in and to look at, some other, better and sustainable means of livelihood. I use that as an example, but I think there is, as I said, a more fundamental understanding of what this does in the end to lives of people in communities and families. And so I think there is a dimension of whether we call it mediation or good offices that may perhaps be a little different. I mean, we've had 70 years of NSG, so let's see if
Perfect. Yes. Big question down there. Go ahead. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Okay, you can be driving for now. Thank you. I was just going to say, as someone on the verge of retirement, I think you're obviously looking forward to future generations, to future possibilities. Unless, of course, there's a new job next year for about 10 years that you might consider. I interviewed Carol Stern recently from UNICEF USA. She had talked about her experiences in Darfur and how she looked at the children of Darfur through the eyes of children significant in her own life. As you reflect on your travels in places like Sudan and Afghanistan and East Timor, can you reflect a bit on the future of children worldwide, the hope that they hold, and perhaps the young people in this room, and what future they hold?
Perfect. Let's take one more question.
There is one thing, and if I can, and I, particularly from where all of you come from, and what you're about, I think that the United Nations has not paid enough attention to youth. And, so this goes a little bit about, sort of children, which is sort of more primary. And so to a certain extent, there is, I think over all these years with, the UNICEFs and, everyone else in the world, and by the way, all the work that I've done in the field, I must really tip my hat off to incredible non-governmental organizations, NGOs, who are working in most remote regions of these countries. So a lot of attention does go towards children in terms of schooling, basic services, health, and all of that. But I think when you look at all these countries, and again, if I reflect, even in driving, very often in South Sudan, in remote regions, it's kind of that angry face of youth who have grown up, in Afghanistan. When I went back to Afghanistan, I first visited in 2002, but then I went back and lived in Afghanistan from 2004 to 2007. There were generations that had grown up in camps, and they didn't know, So, these were 20-year-olds, because by the time I left in 1981, many Afghans were fleeing to Pakistan and Iran, but many of them even beyond that. But the bulk of them who stayed in Pakistan were a generation there. In Darfur, there were IDP camps that, I left Darfur in 2007, but I went back a year and a half ago. Some areas that were camps for internally displaced people have become peri-urban centers. So they've grown up in that. But they have no hope. They have no hope. They see themselves in these refugee situations, in a camp in Sudan, which borders Eritrea. There's a refugee camp of Eritreans who came at that time to South Sudan. There is a cemetery in the camp now, because people have died there, generations, and it's the next. It's in some instances a third generation that's in that camp now. So I think this sense of what is the hope for these young people, and particularly these angry young men who don't have, can't even, it's not in their frame of reference in terms of, what am I going to do, but it's just sort of how do I live, day to day. So I think we need to look much more at that. I think the Sustainable Development Goals will have a lot more on once the Millennium Development Goals are that part of it is done to look more at children's needs. But I think we need to educate children into a more fragile and vulnerable resource situation that they're going to face in their futures. And I know you had a session on climate change, and I think that's
great. The case in Eritrea also reminds that there has to be a relationship between the political solutions, the political work, and the refugees situation, because they're often inextricably related. So, yes, questions? Yes, right there. You're up. Sorry, the microphone's coming around there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mrs. Weinberg, San Francisco chapter. My question is related to John's, actually. I was wondering if there are particular specialists, perhaps child development specialists, trauma specialists that work with the young people who are affected by these crisis situations, and in particular, with regard to human trafficking and child soldiers and young people who experience severe trauma.
Perfect.
Thank you.
We'll take one more question on the right here. Yes, back there. The one with white hair. Microphone's coming right around.
Hi, Dirk Nyhart, East Bay chapter in Berkeley. My question is, what do you think of women in the United Nations? Please reflect on your sexual harassment during your career or the glass ceilings you found. And please give a few words of advice to a young woman who might join the United Nations this year.
Great, thank you. So the two questions, first of all, in terms of working in trafficking type situations, in terms of child protection and other types of psychosocial services, and second is sexual harassment, I think in terms of not only working for the UN, but also in terms of the peacekeeping situation.
Thank you very much for those questions. And in many of the countries that I've worked particularly on peacekeeping, whether it was in Afghanistan, but also more so now in the context of Mali and Central African Republic and many others. One of the issues that I think was of great concern was the use of child soldiers, and so I guess it's almost 2 decades now, maybe a little less, maybe 15 years, that the Secretary General appointed a special representative, particularly looking at children in armed conflict, the situation of children in armed conflict. And when we are in some of these peacekeeping environments, as I have been, and we are involved in what's called disarmament and demobilization and reintegration of militia. So it's DDR, just in short. But when we do those programs, very often we see the use of children as child soldiers, or many women as well who have been taken along with the militia. It's not just for the cooking and everything else, but many women were associated with these militias as what was called comfort women for sexual exploitation, who were being exploited sexually during or many of these campaigns and wars that have been waged in many of these countries. So in these DDR programs, or in the aftermath of conflict, it is absolutely vital, particularly for child soldiers. And I think the most dramatic use of child soldiers was, of course, in Sierra Leone. I think which we know very much about, but also in the LRA. And even when I was in Sudan, there were the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, and there were very many instances where a number of these young soldiers who had been recruited by the LRA were either they were able to escape, but again, the rehabilitation and the psychosocial care and everything else that needs to be done is being done in small part. I don't think sometimes it's larger issues that predominate, and so some of this falls by the wayside. But also when we are demobilizing, many of these militia, and particularly these child soldiers, part of it is to give them additional skills, but that isn't sufficient because then they need to find jobs. And I remember very much in Sierra Leone where young men were trained in certain skills, whether it was auto mechanics or becoming tailors or whatever it is, and then couldn't find jobs. And then suddenly, they hear about, a rebellion happening next door in, Liberia or Ivory Coast or whatever, and they're off because, there's been no ability for them to sustain their livelihoods in the skills with which they were taught. And so they, go back to making what's considered for them easy money by fighting and joining another, militia and all that. So I think these are areas, again, and as I say, so much of it depends on the youth. And, during my time in Afghanistan, I still feel that one of the great failures of the entire international community, and not just the UN, but the entire international community, was no one really paid attention to creating jobs then. And at the time of a country rebuilding itself from conflict, there are tremendous opportunities, particularly with public works programs and other things, where local labor can be harnessed. But sometimes it is the impatience to get a road or whatever it is quickly, and so in Afghanistan we saw a lot of labor that is imported from Pakistan. But very often you look at sort of where the skills are there quickly because you want to get the dividends quickly. So it's always a bit of a trade-off. But is it better to build a road quickly so that people can have access to markets and take their goods, or is it better to go the slow way and try and train the local population and let them work and get jobs in building the roads? And there's got to be some kind of a balance, but I think not sufficient attention paid to getting people jobs. In response to, and the same thing with human trafficking. A lot of what we see in countries, particularly in West Africa now, a lot of it is, the root causes are in money laundering, drug trafficking, human trafficking. These are big issues, and that's why I say that some of when we talk about the politics being, the primacy of politics, is that member states have got to get behind what is the fundamental thing. And a lot of this human trafficking and all of that is actually goes back very often to the uniformed personnel of those very countries. So the very people who are supposed to be protecting the civilians are the ones who are entrenched in some of these power structures that are promoting some of these ills in the country. With respect to sexual harassment, and I've worked for 40 years in the UN. It's not to say that it doesn't happen there as it happens in almost I would imagine any organization anywhere in the world. I think the UN has a enunciated zero tolerance policy for that. I think there is a lot that can be done to improve the internal sort of administration of justice procedures. A lot of work has been done in sort of protection for whistleblowers and others. There's also a separate element, and I remember in 1978 when I was in Indonesia. At the time, I worked. My first assignment was in Indonesia from 1976 to 1978, and I remember when I received at that time there were cables. And when I received the cable saying you're now being assigned to Afghanistan, a number of people said, isn't it going to be difficult for you as a woman, to be going to a Muslim country? And I tell you, it was fine at that point. And even when I went back to Afghanistan in 2004, in many situations, I think. You always have to work, being very pragmatic in terms of understanding the situation you're in, what is good conduct, what is a good way of understanding the culture and being respectful of the culture. So you don't try and defy local norms and cultures and traditions in your conduct of your own behavior. But that's not to say that it doesn't exist. So in response to your question, yes, there are issues of sexual harassment, I think, as there are in many institutions, and those are individual cases that have been addressed, but I don't think I would characterize it as being sort of a rampant issue.
Well, this is truly, we're at time that this has been an unbelievably comprehensive report, everything from sexual harassment to development in Indonesia to peacekeeping in Timor. And it's really been incredibly impressive that you've been able to cover all these subjects today and really help us better understand the UN and how the UN deals with this. One thing to note is that all of the issues that we're talking about today are covered in the new Sustainable Development Goals that are coming online in September. And as we approach Capitol Hill tomorrow, I think one of the most important things that we can do is educate our members of Congress about the new global goals that are coming online. We don't have a specific ask of Capitol Hill at this point related to the Sustainable Development Goals. The most important thing we can do is educate them, make sure that there's a bipartisan consensus moving forward about the important nature of the goals. And over time, the asks will become more specific as it relates to the goals, but the most important thing we can do is educate them, make them feel comfortable with the goals and everything like that. So please join me in thanking Ameerah Haq for doing this.